Zoroastrianism is one of the oldest religious traditions of humanity that still exists today. Yet, its value does not lie in its age, but in the intellectual revolution it initiated. Before the appearance of Zarathustra, the religious landscape of the ancient world was largely polytheistic and operated within a cyclical conception of time, in which the universe endlessly repeated itself without moving toward any final conclusion. Human beings lived in a reality where rituals were performed to maintain the existing order rather than to orient life toward any ultimate purpose of history. In that context, Zarathustra introduced an entirely new idea that history has a direction, a meaning, and an endpoint. Existence is not accidental, but a moral process moving toward completion. This was not merely a religious innovation, but a fundamental restructuring of how human beings understood reality itself. Zarathustra Spitama is a historical figure who exists at the boundary between fact and myth. Western scholars have proposed widely differing dates for his life, but modern linguistic analysis based on the Gathas suggests that he most likely lived between approximately 1500 and 1000 BCE. The language of the Gathas is strikingly close to the archaic Sanskrit of the Vedic texts, indicating that Zarathustra belonged to the early Indo-Iranian cultural sphere. He was probably born in the northeastern region of the Iranian plateau in what is today Afghanistan or Central Asia. He grew up in a semi-nomadic society heavily dependent on cattle herding and was trained within the priestly traditions of his time. It was precisely from within this traditional background that he carried out a radical intellectual rebellion. In the ancient Indo-Iranian belief system, divine beings were widely worshipped regardless of their moral nature. Power, rather than goodness, was the criterion for divinity. Zarathustra completely overturned this logic. He denounced the daivas, entities revered as gods in the older tradition, arguing that they promoted violence, deceit, and chaos. Only Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Wisdom, was worthy of worship. What matters here is not the reduction in the number of gods, but the transformation of the standard by which divinity was judged. For the first time in recorded history, morality became the measure of the sacred. Zarathustra did not ask which god was stronger, but which god was better. This was a philosophical turning point, not merely a theological one. Ahura Mazda is not defined by absolute power, but by purposeful intelligence. His very name expresses this, combining the concepts of lordship and wisdom. In the Gathas, Ahura Mazda creates the universe through thought. Reality is formed from conscious intention rather than from violence or mythological procreation. This implies that mind and meaning precede matter. Some scholars view this as a precursor to philosophical idealism appearing centuries before Plato. The universe is not the result of random conflict, but the manifestation of an intelligent and purposeful order. For this reason, the Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy classifies Zarathustra as the first philosopher in human history. His teaching does not rely on narrative myth, but on a system of ethical and ontological concepts. He poses fundamental questions about truth, order, responsibility, and choice. His religion may be more accurately understood as the veneration of wisdom and truth, rather than the mere observance of ritual. The Greeks later referred to the followers of Zarathustra as lovers of wisdom, a designation that bears a striking resemblance to the Greek concept of the philosopher. According to tradition, Zarathustra received his revelation at around the age of 30, during a vision while performing a water ritual. He was led by Vohu Mana, the good mind, into the presence of Ahura Mazda and other divine beings. This experience completely transformed his understanding of reality and compelled him to begin his mission of teaching. However, he did not achieve success immediately. For many years, he persuaded only a single convert, his own cousin. This illustrates how revolutionary ideas are often met with strong resistance by society. Only after receiving the patronage of King Vishtaspa did his teachings gain the conditions necessary to spread more widely. Under the Persian dynasties, especially the Achaemenid Empire, Zoroastrianism became the spiritual foundation of a vast political space stretching from Egypt to India. When Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon and liberated the exiled Jews, Jewish communities lived for centuries under Persian rule. During this period, concepts such as angels, demons, final judgment, resurrection, and linear time began to appear more clearly within Judaism. Although direct influence remains a subject of scholarly debate, the structural similarities in thought are undeniable. Zarathustra did not build an empire through force, but he transformed how human beings understood themselves. He taught that the universe has a moral structure, that history has a purpose, and that every individual is an agent responsible for the entire order of existence. No one is permitted to stand outside the struggle between truth and falsehood. No one is exempt from moral responsibility. These ideas became the spiritual foundation of many major religions and ultimately permeated the way the modern world understands freedom, responsibility, and the meaning of human life. Continuing along that line of thought, the teachings of Zarathustra reach their clearest philosophical depth when he presents the concept of the fundamental conflict of existence, not as a mythological battle between gods, but as a moral structure embedded within the very nature of reality and within the human mind. At the center of this system is the opposition between Asha and Druj, often simplistically translated as truth and falsehood, but in fact carrying a far broader meaning. Asha is cosmic order, the proper functioning of the world, moral rationality, and the harmony between thought, word, and deed. Druj is not merely lying, but deviation, disorder, and every mode of existence that runs counter to the right order of the universe. Crucially, Asha is not imposed by force, but exists as a standard that human beings are free to choose to follow. It is precisely here that the idea of free will is articulated clearly and systematically, far earlier than in Greek philosophy or Christian theology. Zarathustra affirms that human beings are born with the capacity to choose between good and evil, and that this choice determines not only individual destiny, but also affects the entire course of the world. The universe does not operate mechanically, but depends on the moral decisions of conscious beings, among whom humans occupy a central role. This radically transforms humanity's position in the cosmos from creatures dominated by supernatural forces into moral partners of the supreme intelligence. The concept of Angra Mainyu, often understood as the destructive spirit or evil spirit, is not a rival god equal to Ahura Mazda, but a principle of erroneous thinking and wrong choice. In the Gathas, Angra Mainyu is described as the spirit that chose the bad path from the very beginning, in contrast to Spenta Mainyu, the creative spirit that chose the good path. This shows that evil is not an eternal substance of reality, but the result of a mistaken choice. Evil does not create, it only distorts. This represents one of the earliest attempts in the philosophy of religion to address the problem of evil without attributing it directly to the supreme creator. From this foundation, Zarathustra constructs a highly practical and accessible ethical system. He does not require followers to perform complex rituals or bloody sacrifices. The core of moral life is encapsulated in the principle of good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. These three elements do not exist independently but are tightly interconnected, forming a unified whole. Right thinking leads to truthful speech, which in turn gives rise to righteous action. A good action cannot arise from a distorted thought, and false speech undermines moral order at its very root. This is an ethical vision of deep interiority, emphasizing personal responsibility over external conformity. The Zoroastrian view of death and the afterlife also clearly reflects this moral spirit. After death, the human soul must cross the Chinvat bridge, where the totality of one's thoughts, words, and deeds in life are weighed. For those who lived according to Asha, the bridge becomes wide and secure, leading to a good mode of existence. For those who lived according to Druj, the bridge becomes narrow and perilous, leading to suffering. What is noteworthy is that this judgment is not arbitrary, but the logical consequence of one's moral life. The soul is not punished by the capricious will of a deity, but encounters the natural outcome of the choices it has made. However, Zoroastrianism does not end with a purely individual conception of the afterlife. Zarathustra extends his vision to the shared destiny of the entire universe through the doctrine of frashokareti, the final renovation of the world. According to this teaching, history does not continue indefinitely, but moves toward an endpoint in which evil is completely eliminated and order is restored in absolute form. The resurrection of the dead and the renewal of the material world are central elements of this vision. The world is not destroyed, but purified and perfected. This reflects a positive attitude toward matter and the body, in contrast to many traditions that regard the material world as something to be escaped. It is precisely this linear conception of time, with a beginning, a progression, and an end, that has left a profound imprint on the history of human thought. Before Zarathustra, most major cultures viewed time as an endless cycle, in which successive rounds of birth and decay followed one another without an ultimate goal. Zarathustra breaks this cycle by introducing the idea that history has moral meaning and is moving toward a salvific completion. This conception later became a pillar of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and also deeply influenced secular philosophies of progress in the modern era. Another aspect that is often overlooked but carries significant importance is Zoroastrianism's attitude toward nature and labor. The material world is seen as the good creation of Ahura Mazda and therefore must be protected and maintained in proper order. Cultivating the land, raising livestock honestly, and engaging in productive labor are considered moral acts because they contribute to the strengthening of Asha in the world. Conversely, environmental destruction, laziness, and exploitation are viewed as expressions of Druj. This makes Zoroastrianism one of the earliest traditions to link ethics with ecological and economic responsibility. Over the centuries, Zoroastrianism underwent major transformations as it interacted with different cultures and political powers. Under the Achaemenid period, the teachings of Zarathustra were interpreted in ways suited to governing a multi-ethnic and multi-religious empire. Under the Sasanian era, the doctrinal system was more tightly codified and ritual life became more elaborated. After the Islamic conquest of Persia, many Zoroastrian communities declined sharply but did not disappear. A portion migrated to India, forming the Parsi community, which continues to exist and flourish to this day. Although the number of adherents today is relatively small, the intellectual influence of Zarathustra far exceeds the boundaries of any single religion. The concepts he articulated, universal ethics, free will, personal responsibility, history with purpose, and the ultimate triumph of good, have become foundational to the modern world's understanding of justice, progress, and the meaning of life. When people today speak of standing on the right side of history or of personal responsibility for the future of humanity, they are unconsciously drawing upon a framework of thought that was formed more than 3,000 years ago in the ancient hymns of a thinker who lived on the Iranian plateau. If we view Zarathustra not only as a religious figure, but as a philosopher, we can see that he posed a fundamental question that still resonates today. Who are human beings in a universe with a moral order? And how should we live when we know that our choices carry meaning beyond our individual lives? It is in this question that Zoroastrianism transcends the limits of its own era and becomes a shared intellectual heritage of all humanity. The influence of Zarathustra on major religious and philosophical traditions becomes most evident when examining the period in which Jewish communities lived under the rule of the Persian Empire after the fall of Babylon. Prior to the exile, Jewish thought still bore many characteristics of a national religion focused on communal covenant rather than on individual destiny after death. Concepts of the afterlife, angels, or demons had not yet been clearly systematized. It was during the prolonged contact with Zoroastrian thought that ideas such as final judgment, the resurrection of the dead, and a cosmic opposition between good and evil began to take shape and develop strongly within post exilic Jewish scriptures. Although it is impossible to assert direct borrowing of specific concepts, the deep structural similarities in modes of thinking point to an undeniable intellectual exchange. When Christianity emerged and developed within a cultural space deeply shaped by Judaism, elements originating from Zoroastrianism continued to be transformed and reinterpreted. The concept of Satan as an entity opposed to God bears notable resemblance to Angra Mainyu as a principle of erroneous choice standing against divine order. The idea of angels as intermediary beings serving the supreme will reflects the system of the Amesha Spentus in Zoroastrianism. Even the notion of a savior who will appear at the end of time to bring history to completion shows clear traces of the Sao Shiant in Zarathustra's teaching. What is striking is that these elements, once incorporated into Christianity, were not merely preserved, but were placed within a new theological framework in which love and grace became central, rather than an exclusive emphasis on moral order. Islam later arose in a cultural environment shaped by Judaism, Christianity, and directly by ancient Persia. Many foundational concepts of Islam, such as angels, demons, the day of judgment, resurrection, heaven, and hell, continue to reflect a structure of thought based on linear time and cosmic morality that Zarathustra had already laid the groundwork for. In some Islamic traditions, Zarathustra is even regarded as an ancient prophet, though not explicitly named in the Quran. This suggests that his influence was not merely academic, but penetrated deeply into the religious subconscious of a vast region. Not only monotheistic religions were influenced by Zarathustra, Western secular philosophy also inadvertently inherited many core elements of his thought. The belief that history moves forward, that society can be improved, and that human beings bear moral responsibility for the future are foundational ideas of Enlightenment philosophy and modern theories of progress. Although expressed in rational and scientific language, these ideas still carry a linear conception of time and a belief in the eventual triumph of the good, structures that were first articulated in Zoroastrianism. When modern thinkers speak of the moral progress of humanity, they are operating within a historical framework that remains teleological, even if it has been secularized. A particularly intriguing case is the relationship between Zara and Nietzsche's philosophy. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche borrows the figure of Zarathustra as the herald of ideas such as the Übermensch and the overcoming of traditional values. Although Nietzsche's philosophical content moves in a direction almost opposite to the moral dualism of Zoroastrianism, his choice of Zarathustra as a symbol was not accidental. Nietzsche recognized that Zarathustra was the first thinker to place morality at the center of the universe and was therefore the most fitting figure to proclaim the overcoming of morality itself. Even in negation, Nietzsche acknowledged the historical magnitude of the ancient Persian thinker. In the modern context, as traditional belief systems are increasingly questioned, Zoroastrianism reveals a surprising vitality at the philosophical level. Its core message of personal responsibility, the unity of thought, word, and action, and humanity's obligation to the order of the world retains its relevance in an age confronting moral, environmental, and existential crises. Without accepting the entire theological system, one can still embrace the spirit of Asha as a call to live responsibly, truthfully, and with awareness of the long-term consequences of personal choices. What makes Zarathustra's legacy unique is the rare combination of simplicity and depth. The basic ethical principles he articulated can be understood and practiced by anyone, regardless of education or social status. At the same time, behind these seemingly simple principles lies a complex system of ontology and historical thought that places humanity at the center of a meaningful universe. Zarathustra did not ask human beings to escape the world, but to improve the world through their daily choices. If we view the entire history of human thought as a flowing continuum, Zarathustra appears as a turning point at which humanity was first fully entrusted with moral responsibility for its own destiny and for that of the world. Before him, human beings sought to appease supernatural forces in order to gain protection. After him, they were invited to become collaborators with supreme wisdom in the task of perfecting reality. It is this invitation that has echoed across millennia and continues to challenge each individual to answer the fundamental question of whether we will stand on the side of order or chaos, of truth or falsehood in every thought, word, and action of everyday life. When we place Zarathustra's thought in the context of the 21st century, we can see that the questions he posed have not lost their relevance. On the contrary, they have become more urgent than ever. The modern world, with its extraordinary advances in science and technology, has profoundly transformed human living conditions, but it has not automatically provided moral clarity or meaning. Human beings today possess far greater power over nature, history, and even themselves, yet at the same time, they face the far reaching consequences of every individual and collective decision. In this context, the idea that every thought, word, and action contributes to shaping the order of the world is no longer an abstract religious belief, but an evident reality. Zarathustra did not view human beings as insignificant creatures overwhelmed by the cosmos, but as meaningful links within the overall structure of existence. He held that order is not guaranteed forever, but must be maintained through conscious choice. This is clearly reflected in his understanding of goodness as an active practice rather than a passive state. Goodness is not merely the absence of evil, but active participation in strengthening Asha in the world. Applied to modern life, this means that moral neutrality is not a harmless option, but a way for disorder to spread. Indifference to injustice, deceit, or environmental destruction becomes a form of silent complicity with Druj. One striking aspect of Zarathustra's thought is that he did not place his hope in immediate divine intervention to fix the world. Although he believed in the final completion of history, he emphasized that this process can only unfold through the actions of conscious beings, with human beings playing a central role. This creates a rare balance between hope and responsibility. Humanity does not fall into despair because the ultimate victory of the good is affirmed, yet it is also not permitted to wait passively because that victory depends on present choices. In an age when many people either fall into extreme pessimism or surrender the future to technology or market forces, this message carries a deeply corrective significance. Zoroastrianism also offers a distinctive view of the relationship between the individual and the community. Each individual is responsible for their own choices, but those choices are never purely personal in their effects. They spread outward and help shape the moral atmosphere of society as a whole. When a person lies or acts unjustly, they do not only harm themselves, but also weaken the structure of Asha within the community. Conversely, even a small act of honesty strengthens the shared order. This perspective overcomes the false opposition between personal ethics and social ethics by showing that the two are inseparably connected. In the context of the global environmental crisis, Zarathustra's view of the material world as a good creation that must be protected becomes especially valuable. Rather than seeing nature merely as a resource to be exploited or as something to be transcended in the pursuit of spiritual salvation, Zoroastrianism regards the care of earth, water, fire, and air as a moral duty. Every act that pollutes or destroys the environment is not only a technical mistake, but a violation of the moral order of the universe. This approach provides a profound ethical foundation for modern ecological thinking, going beyond purely economic or scientific arguments. What gives Zarathustra's legacy its enduring strength is the fact that he did not confine truth within a rigid system of dogma. The core of his teaching is not blind belief, but discerning judgment between right and wrong. He calls upon human beings to reflect, to choose, and to take responsibility, rather than merely obey commands. For this reason, his thought can engage in dialogue with followers of other religions as well as with those who are not religious. Asha can be understood as scientific truth, moral order, or personal integrity, without necessarily being tied to any specific belief system. Looking back over the entire intellectual journey initiated by Zarathustra, we can see that he did not merely change how human beings thought about the divine, but more importantly, how they thought about themselves. He granted humanity a new dignity, not based on origin or social status, but on the capacity for conscious choice. Every human being, no matter how insignificant, becomes a meaningful agent in the cosmic struggle between order and chaos. It is this awareness that laid the groundwork for the modern idea of human dignity and personal responsibility. If one were to summarize Zarathustra's legacy in a single proposition, it would be the affirmation that the world can and must be improved through human moral choice. This is not an easy promise, but a demanding invitation. It requires continual awareness, honesty with oneself, and the courage to act rightly, even when what is right brings no immediate benefit. More than 3,000 years have passed since these teachings were first spoken, yet that invitation retains its full weight for anyone seeking meaning in a complex and rapidly changing world. If we continue to probe more deeply, we can see that Zarathustra's thought is not merely a moral or religious system, but a comprehensive way of understanding the structure of meaning in human life. What distinguishes this system from many other ancient traditions is that it does not separate the layers of existence into absolutely opposed realms such as sacred and profane, spiritual and material, individual and communal. Instead, Zarathustra sees all of these as different expressions of a single moral order operating throughout the universe. This leads to a coherent vision in which even the smallest action carries significance beyond the purely personal sphere. In many ancient cultures, human beings sought salvation by withdrawing from ordinary life through asceticism, contemplation, or retreat from the world. Zarathustra took a different path. He did not call upon people to flee the world, but to engage with it more deeply and with heightened moral awareness. Honest labor, caring for one's family, building community, and protecting life all become acts imbued with sacred value. This perspective creates a rare unity between spiritual life and social life, in which there is no gap between the religious person and the person living everyday existence. When compared with other Eastern traditions such as Buddhism or Confucianism, both similarities and revealing differences emerge. Buddhism emphasizes the recognition of suffering and liberation from the cycle of rebirth through inner transformation, while Confucianism focuses on social order, ethical relationships, and defined roles. Zarathustra occupies a unique middle position by emphasizing inner transformation through right thinking, while situating that responsibility within a vast cosmic and historical framework. Personal enlightenment is not aimed solely at individual liberation, but at contributing to the completion of the entire world. It is precisely this point that gives Zoroastrianism a stronger spirit of action than many purely contemplative systems. Another factor contributing to the depth of Zarathustra's thought is the way he addresses the problem of power and violence. In the context of ancient societies where war and conquest were often sanctified, Zarathustra articulated a moral standard that transcended mere strength. An action does not become just simply because it succeeds or is carried out by the powerful. Moral order is not identical with temporary political order. This helps explain why, in ancient Persian history, the ideal king was often associated with justice, protection of the weak, and reverence for truth, rather than solely with military prowess. This represents one of the earliest sources of the concept of responsible power. When this way of thinking is applied to the modern context, it raises a difficult question for contemporary societies. Does technological and economic progress necessarily correspond to moral progress? Zarathustra would likely answer that any progress not aligned with Asha carries the risk of becoming an instrument of Druj. Technology is neither good nor evil in itself. How it is used reflects deeper moral choices. A society may achieve a high level of material development, but if it tolerates deceit, injustice, and destruction, it is in essence still moving against the order of the universe. This perspective provides a powerful critical measure against notions of progress defined solely by quantitative indicators. Another often overlooked dimension is the psychological impact of Zarathustra's system of thought on the individual. Believing that every choice has cosmic significance can create considerable moral pressure, yet it can also give life a profound sense of meaning. Even the smallest actions become part of a larger story. This can help people overcome the existential emptiness common in modern societies, where many feel like mere numbers within vast systems. Zarathustra restores to the individual a sense of being seen, empowered, and invited to participate. At the same time, this system demands a high degree of inner honesty. There is no refuge behind ritual or titles. Thought, word, and action must be consistent. A person may conform outwardly, but if their inner thoughts are governed by falsehood, they are still regarded as standing on the side of Druj. This makes morality a continuous process of self-examination rather than a fixed set of rules. In the age of social media, where images and public declarations can easily conceal true inner motives, this message becomes especially sharp and relevant. If we extend this line of reflection further, we can see that Zarathustra does not offer an easy solution to all of humanity's problems. He does not promise a painless paradise or a salvation that requires no effort. Instead, he places human beings in a position of maturity where no one can substitute for their own choices. The world is not saved by an instant miracle, but by countless small decisions repeatedly aligned with truth. It is precisely this lack of ease that gives his thought enduring persuasive power for those seeking a serious moral foundation. Looking back over the entire trajectory traced in this essay, from historical context and the formation of ideas, through moral structure, religious and philosophical influence, and modern relevance, we can see that Zarathustra appears not as a relic of the past, but as a voice still resonating in the present. He does not provide a detailed map for every situation, but he offers a moral compass strong enough to help human beings orient themselves in times of uncertainty. In an increasingly complex world, where the boundary between right and wrong is often blurred by short-term interests, returning to core principles of truth, choice, and responsibility may not be a step backward, but a necessary return to foundational ground. And perhaps the greatest value of Zarathustra's legacy lies in his reminder that meaning is not something bestowed from outside, but something constructed through how we think, speak, and act each day. History is not written only by empires or great events, but by countless, quiet, individual choices. In this light, every human being in any era is standing on their own Chinvat bridge, not only after death, but in every moment of life, when they must choose between truth and falsehood, order and chaos, responsibility and indifference. It is in these moments that Zarathustra's thought continues to live, continuing to pose the inescapable question of whether we will contribute to making the world clearer and more luminous, or darker and more confused through the way we choose to live. Um, when we continue to expand this line of reflection, we can see that the core of what gives Zarathustra's thought its lasting vitality does not lie in specific metaphysical assertions, but in the way he shapes the relationship between human beings and meaning. Meaning, in this perspective, is not something bestowed from the outside, nor a reward reserved for the victorious, but the result of a life lived in coherence. Human beings do not need to wait for the world to become just or perfect before beginning to live rightly, because it is precisely the act of living rightly that gradually makes the world more trustworthy. This creates a form of meaning that does not depend entirely on objective circumstances, but is closely tied to the inner quality of one's choices. Here we can also see that Zarathustra had already recognized another fundamental paradox of human existence, namely that human beings simultaneously long for certainty and yet must live within uncertainty. He does not attempt to eliminate uncertainty through concrete promises of immediate reward, but accepts uncertainty as a necessary condition of freedom. If all outcomes were guaranteed in advance, moral choice would lose its depth. It is precisely because one cannot be sure that good will triumph immediately that acting for the sake of good becomes an expression of character rather than calculation. In the modern world, where people often seek absolute guarantees from technology or ideology, this perspective serves as a reminder that no system of assurance can replace personal responsibility. From this point, reflection can be extended to the way Zarathustra understands failure and error. He does not regard mistakes as proof of the futility of effort, but as part of a process of moral learning. As long as human beings retain the ability to recognize their errors and adjust their choices, Asha has not been completely lost. What is truly dangerous is not stumbling, but denying the truth about one's own actions. In a contemporary context, where the pressure to succeed leads many to conceal failure or justify wrongdoing, this way of thinking encourages a deeper honesty with oneself, viewing self-awareness as the first step toward healing. Along the same line, it becomes clear that Zarathustra does not separate spiritual life from everyday labor. Moral order is not expressed only in rituals or grand declarations, but in the way people work, communicate, and handle small daily responsibilities. A fair act in trade, a word that keeps faith, a decision that avoids harm despite immediate advantage, all are concrete expressions of Asha. This integration allows his thought to avoid escapism and become an ethical framework capable of permeating social life. Viewed from the perspective of intellectual history, Zarathustra can also be seen as contributing to the understanding of history as a process with direction. History is not merely a sequence of random events, but a space in which moral choices accumulate and gradually shape tendencies. This does not imply rigid determinism, but rather a form of conditional hope. The direction of history depends on whether human beings continue to choose order or not. This perspective helps people avoid both the illusion of total control and the resignation of fatalism. In today's world, where a sense of disorientation spreads as traditional value systems are questioned, Zarathustra's thought can be read as a reminder that human beings do not need to wait for a perfect system before living responsibly. Even amid rupture and contradiction, people can still find a standard to guide their actions if they preserve the connection between thought, word, and deed. That standard does not promise ease, but it offers inner solidity. When reflection is carried to its furthest point, it becomes apparent that the Deepest aspect of Zarathustra's legacy is not a closed doctrine, but a trust in humanity's capacity for moral maturation. He believed that human beings can learn to discern, can correct themselves, and can together make the world less chaotic, even if absolute perfection is never reached in the present. This trust is both humble and powerful. Humble because it acknowledges human limitation, and powerful because it refuses to abandon hope. If this line of thought is extended further, one might say that in an age when many seek meaning through extreme experiences or rapid narratives of salvation, Zarathustra suggests a different path, quieter but more enduring, the construction of meaning through long-term consistency. Not a single moment of enlightenment, but a series of small choices repeated over time. It is in this repetition that character is formed and order is strengthened. And perhaps it is precisely here that Zarathustra's thought touches the most universal depth of human existence, that living meaningfully does not mean living without suffering, but living in such a way that suffering does not destroy the capacity to choose what is right. As long as human beings can still choose to stand on the side of order even under adverse conditions, hope has not been extinguished. This is not a naive hope, but one tempered by responsibility. And as long as such choices continue to be made, the world remains on its path toward completion, even if that path is long and full of turns. For this very reason, he places the good mind, or vohumana, at the center. Before there can be right action, there must be the capacity for right thinking. But right thinking here does not mean clever calculation. It means the ability to perceive the moral consequences of one's choices. A person who possesses the good mind is someone who can move beyond short-term advantage to consider the long-term order of life itself. In the modern world, where many decisions are optimized by algorithms, yet lack moral depth, this idea becomes especially relevant. It raises the question of what true intelligence really is and whether technical cleverness can ever replace ethical wisdom. If we continue to expand this reflection, we see that this thought also contains a very distinctive conception of happiness. Happiness in Zoroastrianism is not a fleeting, pleasant feeling, but a state of harmony with the order of existence. A person may endure hardship, even suffering, and still be considered to live rightly, and thus to possess a deeper form of happiness. This stands in contrast to many modern views that equate happiness with personal satisfaction. Zarathustra seems to suggest that a good life is not necessarily an easy life, but a meaningful one, because it stands on the side of truth. This understanding helps explain why Zoroastrianism does not avoid the tragic dimension of life, but integrates it into a larger framework of meaning. Death, illness, and loss are not denied or seen as inevitable punishments, but as consequences of an unresolved conflict between order and chaos. What matters is not the complete avoidance of suffering, which is impossible, but the refusal to allow suffering to push human beings toward falsehood and destruction. Even in pain, people can still choose to respond with integrity and compassion. From a sociological perspective, one can recognize that Zoroastrianism contributed to the formation of a model of community based on shared moral responsibility. When the words and actions of each individual are understood to affect the common order, no one lives entirely in isolation. This creates a sense of community grounded not in enforced uniformity, but in shared responsibility. Each person differs in circumstance and ability, yet all are equal in the demand to live rightly. This is an early foundation for the idea of universal human dignity. Going further, we can discern the subtle influence of this thought in many later ethical traditions, even when Zarathustra's name is not explicitly mentioned. The idea that history has a direction, that good will ultimately prevail, and that human beings have a role in this process has become foundational to many political and moral systems. Even secular views of human progress bear traces of this structure. though detached from their original theological grounding. Whenever people believe that actions taken today can improve the shared future, they are operating within a framework of thought very close to Zoroastrianism. At the same time, this thought also contains an implicit warning. If history has a direction, it can also be slowed or diverted by accumulated wrong choices. There is no automatic guarantee that good will prevail if human beings remain indifferent or actively support Drudge. This prevents naive optimism and forces a continual moral vigilance. Hope in Zoroastrianism is not blind faith, but a conditional hope that depends on action. The more one writes, the clearer it becomes that the enduring vitality of Zarathustra's thought lies in its rare balance between idealism and realism. He sets very high moral standards without demanding immediate perfection. He acknowledges human weakness and error, yet refuses to use them as excuses to lower the standard. This creates an ethical path that is both demanding and humane. Human beings are called to rise, not condemned forever for their failures. And if we extend this line of reflection even further, we can say that in an age marked by polarization and skepticism, Zarathustra offers a different approach to conflict. Rather than destroying the enemy through violence, he emphasizes weakening Drudge by refusing to nourish it. Falsehood exists only when people lie. Chaos spreads only when human beings act irresponsibly. Each act of integrity withdraws energy from destructive forces. This is a quiet form of moral resistance, but one that is persistent and resilient. Finally, as one continues writing without end, it becomes clear that the legacy of Zarathustra does not reside in a rigid system of dogma, but in a continual invitation to the human conscience. He does not force people to believe, he compels them to think and to choose. In this sense, he is not only a religious prophet, but also a moral thinker of humanity. And for this very reason, even after millennia, even though the world has changed profoundly, the questions he raised remain fully alive. They continue to echo in every moment when human beings must decide whether to speak the truth or to lie, whether to build or to destroy, whether to stand on the side of order or to surrender to chaos. When reaching the conclusion of this entire intellectual journey, what remains is not a closed system or a definitive conclusion, but a profound awareness of the human position within the universe. Zarathustra's thought does not aim to explain every mystery of existence. Rather, it seeks to give human beings a moral point of support from which to live meaningfully amid unavoidable uncertainties. He does not promise an immediate world free of suffering, nor does he console people by encouraging resignation to fate or to the absolute will of the divine. Instead, he grants human beings responsibility and dignity, inseparable from the freedom to choose. Within this perspective, life is no longer a series of random events, but becomes a directed process in which every action leaves a trace. Human beings are neither reduced to mere victims of circumstance, nor elevated to the status of omnipotent centers of the universe. They stand in an intermediate position, both finite and yet capable of making a difference. It is precisely this balance that gives Zoroastrianism its enduring strength, for it neither radicalizes the human being nor renders humanity meaningless. This conclusion also reveals that the greatest legacy of Zarathustra lies not in rituals or theological structures, but in a fundamental moral intuition that truth, order, and life itself must be chosen every day. When people lose faith in large systems, they can still return to three simple principles: right thinking, right speaking, and right action. These three do not solve all the problems of the world, but they are the necessary condition for any solution to endure. In an age when falsehood can spread faster than truth and chaos is often disguised in the language of progress, Zarathustra's thought reminds us that not every change is progress, and not everything new stands on the side of Asha. Genuine progress is always ethical before it is technical. A society may advance materially, but if it loses integrity, it ultimately undermines the very foundation of its own existence. For this reason, the ending is not a closure but a transmission. What Zarathustra left behind does not belong to the past, it is placed in the hands of each succeeding generation. Every individual, when faced with a small choice in daily life, is either continuing or interrupting the long struggle between order and chaos. And it is precisely in those quiet choices that the meaning of history and the future of the world are shaped little by little.